Hello, and welcome to All Things Chemical, a podcast produced by Bergeson and Campbell, a Washington, D.C. law firm focusing on chemical law, business, and litigation matters. I'm Lynn Bergeson. This week, I discuss with Patricia Underwood, Chief Toxicologist and Principal Director of the Chemical and Material Risk Management, Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Department of Defense, and my colleague, Dr. Richard Engler, Director of Chemistry for Bergeson and Campbell and our consulting affiliate, the ACTA Group, the Department of Defense's recent request for information on chemicals undergoing EPA TSCA Section 6 risk evaluation. You know, you probably don't think about this, but the Department of Defense has a significant need for certain chemicals, but admittedly has no tracking system for upstream applications of chemicals to understand the implications of EPA's identification of high priority substances and risk evaluation of them under TSCA Section 6. Doctors Underwood and Engler discussed the recent RFI issued by DoD to provide this line of sight, and they reflect upon the growing importance of supply chain transparency in DoD applications and in the private sector as a whole. Now, here is my conversation with Doctors Underwood and Engler. Tricia, it's wonderful to have you in the studio. I've been looking forward to this conversation. And Rich, you veteran, you're here all the time.
It's always a pleasure, Lynn.
We're just having a wonderful time talking about something of enormous importance today. So thank you both for being here. Tricia, everybody knows Rich Engler. I'm thinking our listeners are probably less familiar with who you are and the important role that you play. So tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Sure. And I just want to say thank you, Lynn, for having me. It's really such a pleasure to be with you and Rich today. And I'm always happy to have the opportunity to talk with folks who are interested in the important role that our program plays in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy Installations and Environment. I am the Chief Toxicologist and the Principal Director for the Chemical and Material Risk Management Program. And our program is particularly interested in understanding critical chemicals in defense and the impacts that emerging regulations have on our responsibility to maintain our mission, but also address and meet our responsibilities to protect human health and the environment.
And Rich, glad you're here, as always.
This is our third time this year. It seems that it's been a busy TSCA year, and I think there'll be plenty more.
Well, our thanks to you, Tricia, because I think the document that we're going to talk about today and why it is, I think, very important for our listeners to understand that of its issuance and its relevance is just of key importance for supply chain reliability. And in that regard, just very recently on May 27th, DoD issued what we call a request for information, or an RFI, that seeks to gather information to identify and assess, and this is a quote from the RFI, critical applications for DoD and the defense industrial base that necessitate the use of existing chemicals undergoing, end quote, EPA's TSCA Section 6 risk evaluation process. Now, I think many of our listeners are super aware of the relevance and importance of the TSCA risk evaluation process, and perhaps less familiar with DoD's heavy reliance upon chemicals that might be entering that process. So can you give our listeners some historical context that explains the critical need for DoD to obtain this information, and give us a sense of whether this is the first ever, or is this one in a series of RFIs? A little bit about the origin and what we can expect in the future with regard to RFIs like this.
Sure. Well, this is the first one that we've issued, but we have a long ongoing requirement to understand chemicals that are critical to defense. And so we go back. I've been working in this program for over 12 years. I joined in 2013. And there's always been a priority for this program to be proactive because there's a need for DoD to know the criticality of our chemicals ever since I joined and before that. The reason being that environmental regulations have been developed over the past time, to manage all kinds of aspects of chemical management. And so we've always had an interest, but since the European Union REACH regulation became established, and then also more recently went through TSCA reform, there's a greater need for us to understand those chemicals that are regulated under those programs and how are those statutory requirements, and then criticality of those chemicals. So ever since TSCA reform and our recent engagement through the EPA process of establishing rulemaking for chemicals under the Section 6 um, regulations, we have had a need to understand or to share with EPA the criticality of those chemicals that they are regulating. And their approach in the past has been to, when they find unacceptable risk associated with particular uses of the chemicals under the Section 6 rulemakings, to either implement a workplace chemical protection program, which limited ability to use those chemicals, or actually prohibit those chemicals. And in those cases, when we can justify criticality of those chemicals and we don't have alternatives, the EPA is able to give us a ongoing ability to use those chemicals even under those regulations, regulatory management approaches. But we have to know what those chemicals are, that they're
Exactly.
important to defense, and we have to be able to justify the criticality, typically through providing a military specification or standard as a justification for why it's critical. So that's something that we've been doing over the past several years as the emerging regulations evolve under TSCA, and we're trying to anticipate that need coming in the future. So in the past, we'd engaged through engagement through industry consortia to try to understand criticality of chemicals in the defense industrial base supply chain. Um, but I think we're trying to move in a direction where we're more structured in our engagement and try to create a sort of enduring process. And so we decided to take a shot at using an RFI as a way to gather the information, hoping that we have a broader capture of interest and information, and also give a signal to industry that this is something that they have an opportunity to engage with us in a more formal way.
So would you say, before we get into the weeds on some of these issues, historically you've been working with industry consortia. Does that to say that you might have been working with your contractor or the supplier of a particular product to gain the information
Yeah, no,
relating to
actually,
criticality?
what we do is in the past, we've engaged with consortia like the American Chemistry Council, the National Association of Manufacturers,
Okay,
AIA, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, to try to
got
get
it.
that broad engagement across industry. And then in those cases, we'll do routine engagement through those consortia. And then if there's companies that want to reach back to us directly, then we've had initial discussions with them that way.
Got it.
Yeah, so I guess it's closer to the end, the
Mhm.
DoD end of the supply chain. You're looking at the largely the suppliers of the final product, not necessarily the suppliers of the suppliers.
Well, I mean, this gets into some things that we might talk about later, but certainly we need all of that information, right?
Sure.
What we really need is the end-to-end criticality of the chemicals in the
Right.
supply chain. Um, it's a tough and very complex problem that we're organically developing a capability to manage and collect this information. So, yes, we start with the products that we procure,
Mhm.
maybe through our SDS, just disclosure of chemicals in those SDSs, but then also engaging with the integrators, the defense integrators, and starting and engaging with them, and then perhaps they are reaching into their supply chain to gain information. But we would like an end-to-end
Sure, no, it makes all the
information.
sense in the world. And again, before we get into some of the questions that I'd love to ask both of you, where can listeners find this RFI? Did I miss it in the Federal Register or is it on a different government website?
It is posted on sam.gov, which is where we always post our RFIs. And I just want to be clear that it's a request for information, and sometimes companies see an RFI and they think it's leading to a request for proposal.
No,
There's
it's
no
not
contract
that.
on this.
You don't want proposals, right?
We are just asking for information,
Right.
and there's no it's not intended to indicate there's any kind of eventual contract here. That's not the point. It's just to get information.
I'm guessing it's the sam.gov where people go to find requests for proposals,
Yes.
RFPs.
Yeah.
Got it. Got it. All right. So the the RFI was issued by the Chemical and Material Risk Management Program. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about this program? And I think you've already begun to explain the criticality of the information for critical materials. But can you provide maybe an example from the early TSCA risk management actions that you've seen to date?
Yeah. So the program is intended to, just like I said, identify the chemicals that are critical to defense. This can range from applications in microelectronics, munitions, batteries, anything
That's a
that's
big one, batteries.
yeah. So, and so the intent is really to be aware of those that are critical to defense. We work across the Office of the Secretary of Defense with our various other offices like industrial based policy and sustainment, acquisition, to know what they know of the chemicals that are critical, and then we look and we scan the horizon for what's emerging in terms of environmental regulations, as well as emerging information about hazard and toxicity of certain chemicals. We take that information, overlay it and ask the question, well, what's emerging as the most critical for defense? That also could have some kind of regulation that would limit our ability to get that chemical or change how we manage that, right? Some of these chemicals are chemicals that we actually have that are needed for the maintenance of our weapon systems. And we want to make sure that we're protecting our personnel and the environment, limiting impact to the environment. So we kind of cover that whole space of um, product stewardship, basically.
Yeah, which is a big footprint. Rich, any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I imagine it's an extraordinarily complex task because you're talking about an enormous organization, Department of Defense, using products from things that are very narrowly designed for DoD, as well as products that are just commercially available. Um, so I can't imagine the number, and I don't know how DoD tracks, but I think of a lot of our clients use SKUs, SKU,
Right.
um, stock keeping units, and it's got to be hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of different products that the entirety of DoD is acquiring one way or another. So it's I imagine it's an enormous task, and it's going to take a long time. We've got to start here, but I imagine this is going to be an ongoing effort to continue to gather the information that you need to inform these sorts of decisions and planning and strategic options going forward.
Yes, and it's something that we've known we've needed a capability to develop to get transparency in the products that we procure and the supply chains that we are relying on. In fact, we've been working with our Defense Logistics Agency partners to establish a way to receive electronic submissions of SDSs on the products that we procure. And we would like more complete disclosure of the chemicals in those SDSs to help us with this task for those that are
Oh,
direct
good
procure.
luck with that.
Yeah.
I
That's
think
right.
all of our clients would
Yeah.
like greater, but, if something is confidential or people assert that it's confidential, does the Department of Defense have its ways of eliciting that information?
So that's the interesting thing. I had said we haven't never issued an RFI before like this, but we
Mhm.
did issue something similar about a year and a half ago that was seeking voluntary participation with DoD by suppliers who would want to disclose in their SDS the full disclosure of chemicals in their products to inform this need, right? Where we
Mhm,
could
mhm.
understand what is critical and anticipate regulation and make sure we're communicating with EPA the potential impacts to defense. And so we had this RFI asking for voluntary participation through our Defense Logistics Agency, who has built a capability to receive this electronically. And can you guess how many people participated? None.
No kidding.
Yeah. Or
That's a
companies
little
anyway. So yeah.
surprising.
Yeah.
Aren't
Yeah,
you surprised?
I'm a little surprised, and I wonder if the final risk management rules have sort of wakened people up
Yeah,
to
maybe so, maybe
it's
so.
like, okay, this is the EPA's approach under TSCA, right? The criticality is going to be a very important piece of information to informing Section 6 rules,
Right.
and being able to write those justifications, those criticality justifications, is going to be an important conversation with DoD. So there needs to be better coordination. So we'll see what the response is from this RFI. We've already heard a fair amount of interest from through the grapevine. So
Mhm,
I
mhm.
anticipate that you'll hear from folks. But we've certainly gotten the message out to our clients, to a number of our consortia. Um, And hopefully this podcast really wakes people up to the DoD's critical need for this critical information.
Well, just one quick question, and I don't know if you two have spoken about this in preparation for this podcast, but criticality, how is it defined for purposes of, I mean, if I were a vendor, my product is critical, period, because there's a good deal of self-interest in making your product critical, but is criticality assessed against some spec or its availability, or is it aligned with EPA's definition of criticality for purposes of exemptions from otherwise restricted provisions under TSCA Section 6? How do you align criticality for purposes of DoD and TSCA?
Well, it depends on the regulation that we're dealing with,
See,
right?
spoken like a true lawyer, it depends. And you're a toxicologist.
Yeah, I got an MBA too, so, I'm a rare bird.
Working on that law degree too, I suppose.
Well, I've spent a lot of time with lawyers, but
It does wear off, I do.
So, it depends on the chemicals. I think, the first thing that comes to my mind, and this isn't in pertaining to TSCA, but, we did have we had a report to Congress on PFAS critical uses that
Yep.
that my program oversaw the development and kind of
Mhm.
submitted that. And we looked to the AIM Act, Mission Critical Military End Use definition,
Mhm.
as a way to kind of baseline criticality in that regard, because we didn't have anything to really go off
That
of
makes
in that
sense.
case. But I think it's also important to recognize that criticality is also about the question of whether there's alternatives that are viable. And in the case of some of the TSCA rulemakings in the past, we've always assessed that if there was an alternative, many times if we were using that chemical or that product that contained that chemical, we would look at whether there was an alternative, even if it wasn't as effective. If it was something that we could adopt, we would, and we do. And one thing I learned recently that was interesting when I was talking to some economists is that that isn't considered a pure alternative or a perfect substitute. And what I learned is that because that product that we went to may not be as effective, and it might change how long it takes to maintain an item or turnaround time.
Any number of parameters could have
We
jiggered
actually
around.
Yeah, we actually were, kind of had to compromise on cost or, operational tempo in that case, and that isn't necessarily what an economist would have expected we do necessarily, right? In terms of evaluating a proposed rule and the impacts to the economy. And so, I do have concerns that if we continue to do this with TSCA rulemakings, we may have incremental income impacts to defense from adopting products that are alternatives, but they don't perform as well. And if that happens over and over, it could have an
Well, it's
incremental.
certainly gonna have an economic impact.
Yeah, and so there are two things. One is if you stack multiple inefficiencies. So if say the alternative is 90% as effective, but you've got five of those that are 90% as effective, then you're starting to talk about some real degradation in that performance. But I mean, it's an excellent question, Lynn. What is economically, what is technically and economically effective, and how much of the performance do you need to get 100%, 99, 90? Like
Yeah, there's no cutoff. I mean, there's no
there's not. It's very difficult
qualitative
to be
standard.
quantitative because you've got efficacy, you've got time efficiency, you've got all these important considerations, and I don't know that you can define a single. I don't know that there is a single definition. You need to look at the specifics of the function of the substance. How is it being used? And is that something where you can compromise a little bit on the performance or a little bit on how long it takes? Um, if you're doing paint removal from a ship and that ship is going to be out of service for the duration of the paint removal, and you're talking about 90%, well, you've increased the amount of time that ship has to be being retrofit. That can end up being a pretty significant economic impact, because now you need more ships to get to the same
Same
performance.
functionality,
The-
right?
so in the end, I think you're going to have to look at the specifics of, again, what function does the substance provide, what function and how much of that function can you get from an alternative? Maybe it costs more but performs as well. That's a different economic calculation than the specific performance. So it's going to be a real challenge.
Are economists, part of your team? I mean, 'cause We could speak all day about the implications of drop-in replacements or replacements, but not so much, or this replacement, it works almost as well, but not quite, or what are the but how do you go about assessing that?
So I think we've been on a learning curve
Okay.
with the TSCA reform and going, and we've learned a lot as we've gone through every rulemaking.
Did REACH teach you anything? Because REACH really had a lot of impacts in supply chain reliability and functionality. Any lessons learned there?
We do have management of emerging regulations under REACH as well in our portfolio.
Mhm.
It's a massively complex and even more prolific regulation as well. We and because the U.S. does not have a seat at the table in terms of a federal agency that can engage like we do with EPA with
Right.
ECA. We never really were in the position where we would even be able to, kind of share back to them our evaluations of the impacts of their regulation, right? So our engagement on REACH was more in the sense of anticipating what was coming and understanding how that would impact our weapon systems and also how that changes or impacts the weapon systems that our allies use that are through our available through our foreign military sales program. So, any kind of evaluation like that wouldn't have been something that we would have probably undertaken because there would be no way to communicate that kind of impact to ECA anyway.
In reading the, RFI, I think DoD is pretty upfront about the limitations that prevail now with regard to a line of sight in tracking systems upstream of applications to understand the implications of developing TSCA and, whatever. It could be a TSCA driver, it could be a state driver. This RFI deals expressly with TSCA Section 6 drivers. What kinds of information are you hoping to elicit, and how do you intend to use the information to build out a more robust kind of systematic program to help fill in that line of sight challenge that you have? 'Cause, I think all of our clients, Rich, in the private sector have really, really, really important functions, but DoD is kind of a cut above. You really want what the Department of Defense is doing to be reliable, dependable, and not subject to supply chain or other types of surprises. So how is this information going to help in that regard?
Well, I think first of all, we really just we talked a little bit about wanting to know what the criticality is in our products that we're
Mhm.
procuring, but then also we'd like to know, and we'd like to kind of inspire or incentivize, right? That industry starts to kind of prioritize understanding what's in their supply chain and what's critical, especially if they're linked to defense and sharing that information with us. So we'd like to see industry take the lead to look into their supply chain and create that momentum to go deep into it, right? Into and get to that end to end understanding.
Mhm.
I think we know where to go to understand maybe a lot about the feedstock chemicals in terms of working like with the American Chemistry Council and the chemical manufacturers. And we know where to go to talk to the integrators like the Boeings, the Lockheed Martins, and those that make the weapon systems that are
Right,
important
the
to
big
us.
defense contractor
But
sorts.
yeah, the
Right.
defense contractor base. But we know that there's a huge blind spot in the middle of that end-to-end supply chain. And so I would love to see our, kind of the bottom of the supply chain ask the question to their suppliers, what's which of these chemicals are gonna be regulated are critical to you? And then see those suppliers then in turn ask their
Mhm.
suppliers, and maybe that will be one way that we can build that connection in the supply chain that isn't there today for many. I think this is a problem across the board, not just for chemical regulation,
Oh,
right?
yeah. It is definitely a problem.
So I would love to try to inspire that to
Mhm.
happen. I know it's moderately inspired at the moment, but we'd like to create momentum there.
Mhm.
I also would like to better understand as we receive information back. I would very much appreciate if manufacturers would tell us, especially chemical manufacturers, if a future rulemaking is going to change what they manufacture. And if they anticipate a significant drop in demand because maybe they're supplying more broadly to non-defense uses, we wanna know if that's gonna change what they decide to manufacture and then create potential obsolescence for defense because we're not a major, um,
Market, yeah.
market for them. That's a real problem for us, and if that's gonna happen, we want to know because we certainly will prioritize finding alternatives then, right, if that's gonna be the case. or we'll work to engage with EPA perhaps through our EO 12866 review process to share that information and make sure that they're aware that the approach that maybe they're taking for managing risks is going to have an impact to defense. And
which is a very important point you just uttered, Tricia, that you need to communicate timely and completely with EPA if there's going to be an adverse impact on a critical aspect of DoD, and so listeners, focus on that because that's a very important point of working cooperatively with the entire federal family to ensure that there is a real understanding of the criticality of chemicals, and so it takes effort on both sides of the equation and all sides of the equation. And in that regard, Rich, from your perspective, what should stakeholders be doing to obtain greater insight on supply chain dynamics? I know you talk to countless stakeholders in the TSCA area, but what steps should be taken now to help ensure that there are no surprises and
Yeah, well,
no adverse consequences?
we've been talking for years about more supply chain transparency.
Transparency.
Is how can folks, especially downstream, get the information that they need uh, from the suppliers upstream from them so that they can make informed decisions, whether it's DoD or an automaker or a consumer product producer. And sort of what's really called for here, and again, we've discussed this in years past. I mean, this has been an ongoing conversation for quite some time. Is can we develop essentially a clearinghouse where members throughout the supply chain can go and provide the information on on their particular product wherever
Mhm.
they are, and it might be the raw material supplier, it might be the end developer of a munition or an aircraft, and if that database is robust enough so that they can, and it's composable because you need to be able to take all the things all those raw materials and you make something more complex, and eventually you end up with, say, a fighter jet. Um, then the DoD could get that, like, oh, this part of the fighter jet or this part of the fighter jet's maintenance or operation relies on this particular CAS number, and the EPA is looking at that.
It's
So
focusing on this
it's
CAS number right now for
right. So
TSCA
so make
purposes.
sure that the it can go the information can go back to the supply chain. So whoever's manufacturing or importing or that initial processing of that substance is aware, so that the connection can be made between that critical defense need, that function wherever it is in the supply chain, and the conversation with EPA. And that's going to be a real challenge.
Mhm.
Confidentiality, you already talked about, Lynn,
Yeah, CBI.
is a real challenge. So can we develop a system that protects the confidentiality, legitimate confidentiality of the supplier, but gives the rest of the supply chain the information that it needs, so that flags can be, raised when there's something that needs to happen. And it'll need to not just hold the information, but it'll be supplier certifications. And this would have helped a lot with the PIP 3-to-1 PBT rule back
Yeah, that
in
definitely comes
2021.
to mind a
If
number
there
of
if
years
there had
ago.
been better visibility about supply chain, oh, yeah, PIP is in this particular part in this particular electronic widget, then there could have been better information. EPA could have been better informed for the rulemaking, and frankly, the electronics community could have been better informed about the importance of the rulemaking because they would have been aware of what was in their products. So, and that was 2021,
Right.
right? So
It's
we've
4
been
years
talking about
ago.
this now and the need predated that, and some industries have done more to develop these data systems, but we really need something that's much broader. And I don't know who's going to put it together, but at some point we need to have a data system that the information can go in, can be maintained as confidential, can have that robust information, and can be, it has to be dynamic enough to be updated as new products become available and things change, but also needs to be able to raise the flag when when somebody needs to be alerted.
Rich, in that regard, what TSCA provisions exactly are relevant to this conversation? TSCA Section 6G1B comes to mind when addressing national security and critical use applications, but DoD cannot see upstream. I mean, you can see what you can see, and to use a phrase, you don't know what you don't know, right? So you don't necessarily have any way of knowing 5 steps up what critical compound is going to be relevant to a critical application or defense application. And Rich, a lot of our clients who make chemicals or process them or reformulate them may or may not know the end application. So to your point, how do you broker that information in a way? Is there an app? You're Tricia, you're a supply chain expert. You no, you are. You're very modest, but you're a supply chain expert. Is this some functionality that the sam.gov website or some portal where there can just force greater transparency? 'Cause it's Tosca's been around a long time. Lautenberg's been around going on 9 years. We're coming up to its 9th birthday party. And there's still, even in the private sector, a lack of full understanding of the enormous breadth of the application of Tosca's jurisdiction. In other words, to use your example, Rich, on the PIP side, people often, to this day, don't appreciate that TSCA applies to finished articles that are imported into the United States. And so if there's a little itty bitty bit of PIP in a finished good, TSCA applies. That's an important recognition that is still lost on a sizable chunk of the regulated community, despite our despite
Or continued
our
attempts.
continued, urging to revisit this topic. But what are your thoughts on brokering that union between the private sector and the government sector to help with supply chain transparency?
I mean, this has been a conundrum we've been thinking about for a decade or more. I mean, we saw this. We're a proactive program, so we actually saw
Yeah.
this need a long time ago. I think industry was definitely not ready 5 years ago. And I think maybe the momentum is building now, in which there's a realization that this needs to happen, right? And there's more drivers than just regulation, like we talked about. There's such a huge need to know what's in your supply chain from so many different um, challenges that manufacturers are facing. So from our end, we are interested in solving this problem. We're contemplating lots of different approaches within DoD to create policy, and perhaps even contract language to drive it forward if we need to. And we will do that if we have to. Um, but I'm hoping that we all kind of decide to move in this direction together, and it's easier than that, to be honest.
Yep. Hope
Because
springs eternal.
yeah, yeah, but if we have to, we will start putting the requirement for disclosure in our contracts.
Mm, that's
Um,
one way. That's one way. Would you have established protocols with EPA or other federal agencies to, like in every Federal Register notice, for example, on TSCA Section 6, do you have like a specific blurb in there about, and remember, you think about applications that might have, critical national interest, but again, that probably wouldn't suffice, right? Because if you knew that, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, who's responding to the rule?
Right, right.
And to your point, Lynn, the chemical manufacturer doesn't necessarily know what their customer's doing,
I
and,
often
and if
don't.
you have multiple layers between that raw
Right,
material supplier and DoD, that is a conversation. I mean, it's practically a game of telephone, right?
right.
So how many people need to hear the message,
Mhm.
or DoD is saying, "We need to hear this," and the producers are like, "Make sure DoD knows that this is happening," and getting that connection across that divide.
I think it would also be helpful if, when any manufacturer is providing information to EPA under in the docket in anticipation, like in reviewing a draft rule and providing comments, if they're commenting in regard to defense applications, it would be very helpful if they let our program know as well. We do a lot of effort combing the docket, but we're a very small group, and
When you say you're a small group, how small are we?
we're we're 4 people.
Sorry about the audible gasp, really?
We have a contract support, right, staff that does a lot of the very technical analysis, that we do, but we're 4 government people that are shrinking all the time. So,
And in that regard, Tosca is just one driver, Reach is another driver, but we've got a bunch of other drivers that, in my view, we spend a lot of time on European and global initiatives, product stewardship initiatives, all of which force transparency. We've got the EU deforestation program coming up, which may or may not be relevant to DOD, I suspect it is. PFAS, we talked a little bit about the importance of PFAS and all of the reporting, PBT regulations. This is going to increase the burden on the pressures that we're looking at now in terms of diminishing what I call blind spots in the supply chain. So you're going to need more people, Tricia. This problem is Tosca is illustrative of one dynamic, but there are multiple dynamics. The federal, state, and European and global initiatives are all forcing transparency. I think that it will only get more intense going down the road.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing growing numbers of things like the deforestation on top of conflict minerals, on top of the PBT rules, the state PFAS reporting. All these things are just layering on top of. So even if we had this magical, we could wave our magic wand and create this database. The database is going to need to be evolve as these new issues come up and
Programs
these
do,
new
right?
drivers from wherever it's coming from, whether it's state or U.S. federal or global, whether it's treaty global or other jurisdictions like the EU. Um, the the database is going to need to say, "Oh, now we need this additional bit of information about your product," and everyone who's in there, everyone who's got their product in there is gonna have to go and update and say, "This is the status under whatever that new thing is," whether it's deforestation or the next thing that happens. So this is it's gonna be permanent employment for somebody, um, and it's gonna mean increasing, effort on everybody's part. It's gonna take a lot of, uh, 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 person time to
Right.
to build the thing, to populate it, to keep it up to date, query it. Supply chain transparency is gonna be an enormous effort, but it's critically important.
And I'd just like to add that it's a diverse skill set, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because I think toxicology and the understanding of toxicology is at the core, because that's what we're trying to do, right? Is to address concerns for exposure to human health and environment, and that is driven by an understanding of the toxicity of the chemical that's being regulated. But it requires also supply chain experts, economists, even market analysis,
Oh,
right?
for
Mhm.
I mean,
sure.
one thing
Yeah.
that we've been surprised about is not, is how environmental regulation or the mere proposal of an environmental regulation can shift the market, and the suppliers can decide to not even, for example, decide to not even invest in the domestic manufacturing because of a proposed threat of regulation. That's very concerning for us because there are cases where we really want all our supply chain to be domestically located for defense purposes. And so those are also skill sets that are needed in that group of people, that's understanding the supply chain, but also the reaction of the market space to the proposed regulation.
Rich and I speak endlessly about, I don't want to say the fragility of the market, but to the extent that it reacts the same way as Wall Street does. If there's a whisper of a regulation or characterization of a chemical that could have a commercially adverse consequence, you need to manage that information because it can cause an exodus it faster than you can say, "Oh, darn, we really need that chemical." So the fragility and the sensitivity of the commercial market to these types of regulatory drivers is a very important aspect, and to your point, requires a skill set that will build out the program.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sensible business decision. You're like,
Yeah.
"Well, I'm gonna invest this enormous amount of money. Am I gonna risk investing it in the United States where, I may spend 5 years and $500,000,000 and build this facility, and then a year later, I'm gonna have to shutter it because of something that, some regulation that's coming down the pike, build it somewhere else or exit that market." So it's a very sensible thing for businesses to do, um, right? Businesses are looking to survive themselves.
Mhm.
Um, so I don't wanna make it sound like, it's wrong for a company to say, "We're gonna invest somewhere else or in something else." that is the reality of the market and why it is so important for people to understand the economic impacts and to use Trisha's term, that market reaction.
Right.
And I think that what I hope companies realize is that they really can go talk to EPA,
Right.
Yeah,
right? They should utilize that opportunity to engage with the agency and share their concerns and their intentions, and perhaps create some certainty that allows, you know, them to achieve that. What we encourage is to domestically locate manufacturing, especially for defense related applications.
No, it's a very good point. I think EPA, Dr. Beck, her team at the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention has been very receptive to understanding exactly what information is needed to build a better rule, to understand the market consequences of regulatory actions. So it's really give and take. It's the government is willing, able, and receptive to information, but industry needs to provide it.
right.
So we're always urging our clients to get whatever your thoughts are, get them in writing and put them into the comment docket. And in
And
that regard,
oh, well,
oh, I'm
yeah, just
sorry.
me. The I don't want to lose sight that we're not talking about compromising safety,
No,
health,
not at
and
all.
safety for the environment. We're talking about constructing the rule in a different way,
Right.
so that the market is not scared off. It's like operate within these parameters,
Mhm.
as opposed to we're going to ban. I mean, part of it is how EPA frames the rule, that frames talking about the rule, and then how do they construct the rule? And can the rule be constructed in a way that is protective but also economically viable?
I mean, I think
Exactly.
a good example is just making sure that the condition of use that you were planning is captured.
Yeah.
Because one of the problems, as I understand it, is if that condition of use does not get captured in that draft rule, then it's not a regulated use that's allowed. So I
Right.
think that
It'll
that's
be
the
banned instead of allowed under
yeah,
WCA.
Right.
and
It's a
so it's
presumptive ban.
sometimes it's very simple. It's not really anything to do with whether you're being what or it's not to do with whether you can be protective of human health and environment. It's just a matter of following that procedural process to capture that condition
Right.
of use.
No, that's a super important point, and thank you for raising it. So, getting close to home here, when is the RFI due?
It's
Coming up.
June 20th.
June the 20th, okay, so that's fast approaching. We're gonna publish this podcast really quickly. Again, you already identified it would be in the sam.gov portal, right? And there are opportunities for expressing CBI, I'm sure, right?
I think that if there's an interest to provide, proprietary sensitive information, just the organization should send us an email to that. We have a program mailbox. Let us know that you'd like to engage with us, and we'll work with you to figure out how to receive that information and protect it.
And how can listeners obtain additional information on the Chemical and Material Risk Management Program writ large? Because you do lots more than just prepare RFIs.
Yeah, well, we have a website on the Denex website for Department of Defense, so we can provide you with that link if you
Yeah,
want
we'll
to
we'll post it
share it on
with
the
the podcast when it comes out.
yeah.
Great.
And we're happy to share information that way. And then also, if there's any direct questions, again, they can email our program mailbox.
And any other RFIs floating around in your head to get out this year?
I think we're gonna this. This is a great question. Thank you, because I didn't get a chance to caveat that this is our first time doing this, so we're asking for a lot of grace from our
It
stakeholders
was a
and.
great RFI. You don't need to make excuses for it. I mean, I
Well,
think it's a brilliant idea.
Well, we don't know what kind of response we're gonna get, and we're a very small group
Yeah.
of people, and so, it seems to have gone a little bit viral, and that's good, and we want information, and I hope we get it, but w if we get a lot of information, we are gonna have to try to figure out how to process
How to
all of
deal
that,
with it, right?
and we're gonna have to figure out how to, like, validate, the criticality, the claims of criticality, that kinda thing, so, the criticality, the claims of criticality, that kinda thing, so, we're learning as we go.
Mhm.
But if it's successful, we plan to continue to issue these as questions of the next chemicals come up that are going to be regulated under TSCA. But we can use this process to gain information for any other chemicals. Again, we are interested in what's happening in Europe under REACH as well. And you know, I hope it's successful in that case. We'll just continue to issue these on a routine basis as a way to collect the information until we have a better way.
So one of the questions we got after we contacted our clients, we got back is, is the RFI limited to the cast numbers that are specified? And I asked you that question so that I could respond before we got a chance to speak today. And what you said is yes, and I would sort of caveat the yes to say the timing is most critical for these because of the
The regulatory
timing of the
drivers,
TSCA
right?
regulatory actions. But you are open to other information. But if somebody is sending in information other than these handful of cast numbers, recognize that your group will prioritize the handful of cast numbers that are there, and the other stuff might be a later conversation. So to your point, asking for grace, if you're replying on other chemicals that aren't in the list, if I can speak for you, DoD is interested in hearing about it, but recognize you may not have that more fulsome conversation until later.
That's right. I probably will depend on the criticality and, the emerging regulation and or not, and whatever the context of the issue is that you send us. So, yeah.
Well, Dr. Tricia Underwood, Dr. Richard Engler, great conversation. Thank you for coming into the studio today, both of you, to report on what we regard as a brilliant, wonderful, and we think ultimately successful RFI.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to speak with you both today.
Good.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
All right. Thank you. Thanks again to Dr. Underwood and Dr. Engler for speaking with me today about the Department of Defense's request for information and the need for supply chain transparency. All Things Chemical is produced by Jackson Bierfeld and Bierfeld Audio, LLC. We'll be back again real soon to further inform and entertain you about all things chemical. Bye-bye.